Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Ask and Wonder, the show that brings Christians and skeptics together to talk about the big questions in life. And this is Christmas Eve, and this is where we are. We're just having conversations about the big questions. This is what we love doing. And today we have an interesting topic. The topic is human life intrinsically valuable? I actually went to the dictionary to make sure that I knew the meaning of intrinsic. And it seems to be a synonym of essential. This is a very interesting question. And for this conversation, I have the privilege to spend time with two friends, atheists, secular thinkers, Joel Diemoz. He's a philosopher. Hi, Joel. How are you, man?
Hey, I am so pumped to spend my Christmas Eve trying to make some progress on, I think, a really interesting question. I am doing great, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. And Elliott, friend, atheist, secular thinker. How are you, Elliott?
I'm great, man. Yeah, I definitely, I agree with yours and Joel's sentiment. There is no better place to be Christmas Eve or otherwise, I think, than right here tackling this stuff. So I'm excited.
Yeah, cool. So for everyone that is watching, just know that you can listen to this as a podcast version. You can go to iTunes and look it up. You can go to the search bar and type Ask and Wonder. You'll see it there. And if you have any questions, as I always say, you can email me at askandwondernashville@gmail.com. Well, guys, I just heard someone saying that all our problems and everything that we have gone through is going to end on January 1st, 2021. Do you guys think that is true?
Yeah, I don't know about that quick of a turnaround, but we may make some steps in the right direction. So, I mean,
how was your year in general, Joel and Elliott? How was everything for you guys?
You know, COVID obviously presented a challenge to everybody. For me, it actually wasn't a bad year. I did try to hunt the good stuff. I worked out because I had more time because of COVID, more sort of free time. I got into a really good workout rhythm. Shed a few pounds. Graduated college like we were talking about before. So I think overall it wasn't a bad year for me. But I'm sympathize with other people that probably had a much worse year for economic reasons or for health reasons.
Definitely, man. And what about you, Elliott? How was everything for you?
pretty similar to what Joel was saying. Not exactly the same achievements in my life. I did not lose any weight, but congrats, Joel, and congrats to college. But all in all, there wasn't anything. I was lucky enough to have come through it, pretty much unscathed. I didn't lose a job. I haven't lost anybody close to me and stuff, and that's really wonderful. So definitely grateful for all of that. My anxiety's been through the roof since March, so that'd be nice for that to come back down. But if that's the worst I've got, man, that's nothing. So.
Well, it's understandable because of some of the things I do. I've had conversations and have spent time with people that, they're going. Some families are going through tough stuff, and the anxiety situation is also bad because people are not capable of spending time and have conversations. But bit by bit, I think. I'm actually very excited because I just want to bring Ask and Wonder live again. Although I will continue doing this, but I really want to just spend time with people, But okay. Well, let's jump right into today's topic. The reason why I chose this topic, and I think Joel knows a little bit. I think I didn't tell you, Elliott, the other day. I went to get an ultrasound because my wife is pregnant. And
Congrats, man. That's awesome.
Yes.
To be clear, they weren't ultrasounding you.
Oh yeah, okay, that's fair.
By the way, I've been a musician all my life, and when they told me this is an ultrasound, I said, okay, this is not a mega sound or a super sound. This is an ultra. I was very scared, but no, nothing happened. I was just there. And definitely, even though as a Christian theist, I've come to some conclusions about the universe, I was, I keep asking questions about life and why the aesthetics of the universe, why is everything the way it is, the ontology of it is just crazy. So when I saw that little being inside of my wife's womb, definitely I got very excited, and all these feelings and emotions started to overwhelm me in a good sense. But then this question came to me. I started wondering, is this just my feelings because this is part of my family? Is there something outside of it? And then I thought about you guys. I said, I really want to have conversations with people that might actually think differently than what I think, so that we could just see what happens. So I'll start with you, Elliott. The question itself, is human life intrinsically valuable? What do you think about the question? Do you think that the question is actually, how do you say this? It's kind of framing the subject too much, or is it kind of entailing a way of thinking? What do you think about the question itself?
I think it is a good question, and I think it's one that a lot of us on every side, because even God believing or lack of God belief or non-God believing sides, there's so many nuances to all of us in our positions, and I think this particular question does have a good bit of nuance. And oftentimes when I approach this question and I think about answers for it, I tend to break it up into two main categories. And one of them is, does human life have intrinsic value to existence as a whole? And then the other category I tend to frame it around is, does human life have intrinsic value to humans? And I think we can answer that first question with a no. And although that may potentially lead us down some troubling routes that may give us a little bit of confusion or anxiety about our place in the world, or what we're supposed to do with our lives. I don't think that matters as much, especially if, as I believe, the second answer to that second question is actually yes. I think it is possible from an entirely materialistic an entirely naturalistic, non-supernatural, non-divine way to say, well, actually, yes, there is something special about humans, for humans, as opposed to, say, an oak tree for humans. Now, maybe oak trees are important to other oak trees. We don't know that, but it doesn't seem to be the case that the universe is really the things that are happening in the universe don't really seem to be focused on us. But the things that happen in human society very much seems to be focused on people. And so I think, depending on where we put that lens, we might get a little bit of a different answer. But I think I can get to both of those answers without ever having to appeal to anything outside of what it means to exist, what it means to be alive, what it means to be matter and energy. I don't think we need a divine spark exactly for us to go, yes, humans are important. I think we can just, think about what it's like to be a person for ourselves and our own experience of consciousness, and translate that into other people and say, look, if it hurts me when I touch a hot stove, it's probably going to hurt Joel and Pedro, and and work from there. So a little bit of both sides, just depending on where we want to go.
Yeah, that's interesting distinction, to existence and to humans. Okay, well, Joel, what's your view on the question?
Well, I'm with Elliott insofar as I think that it's important to make some progress, or I think it's actually really valuable, if you will, to make some progress on this topic from a secular point of view. I don't mean secular and atheistic in the same equivalent terms. I mean, secular just means sans a particular God. I think that if we approach this from a secular point of view, it's more interesting because it's more universal. If we could come up with arguments or reasons that humans have intrinsic value that aren't predicated on a particular God belief, I could take that to somebody in India that has a completely different culture or society or theological understanding. But if I can give them compelling secular reasons, compelling reasons based upon a shared human experience, not a particular religious experience, but a shared human experience, I think that those reasons will be more compelling. Now, for the question itself, I tried to parse it out, try to break it down into little chunks that we could sort of talk about and maybe make progress on. So do humans have intrinsic values? Pedro, you already touched upon intrinsicness. I think that maybe might be the first definition I'll look at. I tried to think of an example of an intrinsic property of something else. And the best that I can come up with, and this is kind of a classic example from philosophy, is intrinsic to a triangle is the sum of its angles will add up to 180 degrees. Where you have triangles, you have three angles that will add up to two right angles, 180 degrees. Now, that is, in the business, what we would call like a definitional truth. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of just baked into the meaning of the word. My question, I guess, for you, Pedro, when you say that humans have intrinsic value, do you mean that by definition they're valuable? Or are you saying something else that maybe what we would call like an analytic truth, like it's actually it's not just in sort of a definitional attribute of humanity? Maybe, I guess, what do you think? We can at least start there. Yeah,
definitely. And you guys raised a very good questions. I think we could pursue some of them. But definitely I will try to give you my perspective on that. If I didn't believe in God, then the first thing I would think is, how do I know, just following Elliott's arguments, for example, how do I know that human life is valuable for humans, and human life is not valued in terms of the existence of the universe as a whole? So my first problem would be the epistemological problem of it. So how do we know that? I would start from there. And since at the end of the day, from a secular standpoint, as much as I understand it and as much as I investigate it, the big questions in life end up being just brute facts. I just imagine, for example, that's what I see, like the answers that you would give about the universe. If you put all the questions that would describe what the universe is in front of a blackboard, and you would see everything, the theory of everything, you would see everything there. You would actually explain everything in terms of the describable aspects of it. But then the question would remain, why does our universe look the way it does, and why is it describable that way? So from the secular standpoint, I think, things are the way they are. So I don't know how you could get meaning from it, but I don't know, because my problem is that I want to find a reason why I can find meaning in those things. Now, as a Christian theist, definitely, Joel, the reason why I think that human life is intrinsically valuable is because God has told me so. It is something definitely that it is like finding truths in the universe. Like when we describe things, we actually don't get to know things objectively. So it's something that I get to know also by, as we call in theology, as revelation. Then as I experience life, and then I communicate with others, and I see what has happened in other cultures and the way our societies are moving forward, both under the religious and the secular context. I think experience gives me more reasons to think that actually human life is intrinsically valuable. That's where I would go with my answer. What do you guys think about that?
I want to quickly touch on what Joel said first, because I think very much what he was talking about the idea of, something is true by the definition, right? The triangle just has three sides. That's just what is the definition of a triangle, and you can't have it any other way. I think that's very much kind of the vein where I was thinking about when I answered the second question about intrinsic value amongst humans. That although maybe we haven't exactly pinpointed the bullet points or figured out exactly what all boxes need to be checked, but I think we can at the very least say that there is a set of criteria that equals human, and I think it's very possible that some of those criteria are things like consciousness and empathy and a desire to see those around you doing well and a desire for you to do better. I think all of that is potentially possible. And kind of going back to what you said about the concept of like brute facts, I'm not exactly a huge fan of that terminology, and I think possibly it's because some people use it in kind of a hand wavy manner where they just go, well, it's a brute fact, and we move on, you know. But in fairness, especially again, if we think about it from this idea of, look, there's just boxes that have to be checked before something is a frog. Then if all these boxes are checked, it's a frog, and it's like, okay, but why does this box need to be checked? It's like, well, it's just part of the definition. Like it just an oak tree has to have these qualities, and I personally don't find that particularly upsetting, especially as I've over the last few months I've listened to some other people try to get to, you know, an objective goal for morality in different ways and all this, and one of the things that keeps kind of coming back to me is just this idea of, you know, potentially those boxes being emergent, right? Those characteristics being an emergent property, like humans. If the universe started 1 second ago and humans existed just now and there weren't these boxes of empathy or consciousness or whatever, well then no, probably we wouldn't even have value to other humans intrinsically. But if some of the things that we define about what it means to be human relates to these things that are ultimately the underpinnings of morality in one way or the other, well then again it you know, it may not be the most satisfying answer to just say, well, by definition humans want to be moral, but that may just be the case, and honestly I don't personally have a problem with that, because that kind of feels like, to me, at the end of the day, it's kind of like, well, we can't really prove that logic works without using logic. And it's like, yeah, I'm cool with that. If that's the only thing out there that we have to just kind of say, okay, look, we'll take this, and if we're ever shown otherwise, then we'll accept the new answer, but how the heck would you even do that? And if that's the one thing, I'll take it. But if it's that, and then it's this, and then it's this, and then it's this, I'm like, okay, we got to know about these others. You know, I'll accept the one, but I don't want to add too many unnecessarily.
Well, so Elliott, if I may push back, you did claim that you weren't a fan of brute facts, and then it seemed like, forgive me if this isn't the case, I'm misunderstanding you, it seemed like you appealed to brute facts for something.
So you're basically right.
Unrelated to the topic, though. You're trying to establish logic as a brute fact, but that could be the case, but that doesn't get us anywhere towards the value being a defining attribute. It could. It certainly could.
And what I mean by that is, if we just take, let's say, for instance, the true dichotomy of exist versus non-exist. Whatever the criteria are for those two categories, they would have to be different from each other to distinguish them apart. If we just say, and again, if is doing a lot of work here, which is why I'm not claiming this is true, but if we were to say, well, the defining characteristics of what it means to exist is these three laws of logic, right? And everything that exists has to adhere to those criteria, because otherwise they wouldn't exist. If that continues to multiply, right? So we have an individual unit that adheres to the laws of logic, so it exists, and we have an individual unit, and so on and so forth. And then minor changes occur through those things. Now we have multiple individual units and a great diversity of those units. Well, we may have an emergent property that comes from that, just the same as we have the idea of hydrogen and oxygen aren't water and they don't make wetness. And just because we have one molecule of water doesn't mean we have an ocean, but we can look at a river and say, yes, that's what defines a river. And a river, like, let's just say intrinsically has banks, right? A river, because otherwise it would be a lake or an ocean or a puddle. You kind of see where I'm going. Again, it's not it's not fully fleshed out at all, but I think it's a possibility for us to take steps in that direction. And that would be a manner in which we don't have to appeal to anything outside of the natural world whatsoever. We don't need anything else on top of that. And that is a potential path, I think, that could get us there.
Let me ask you a question about this. You said something. I wish we had time to pursue all of these things, but I'm actually writing them down. Because you mentioned something, Elliott, like the existence is dependent on the laws of logic, but I don't know if we have time to pursue that. I'll just put it there just to see if we can bring these.
And really, just real quick on that, I wasn't saying definitively for sure that.
Oh, of course. Definitely.
I definitely don't know off the top of my head whether that is true, but I believe that there is a route through the concept of if that's the underpinning of just that first true dichotomy of exist versus non-exist, it's possible that can lead us to more dichotomies that are within the actual bounds of existence that still all adhere to the original characteristics, but now, because instead of just a hydrogen atom, and an oxygen atom, now we've actually got a bunch of molecules of water, and now maybe we can get to oceans, So I don't have it fleshed out in the slightest, and I think if I did, I'd be very, very well compensated, but that isn't the case yet.
Well, that is good. Let me ask you a question, Joel, because I actually got a bit stuck. I really want to understand the way you approach that question. When you Joel formed an analogy with the truism in the conceptual basis of describing a triangle. It's a sum of three angles of 90 degrees. How would you compare that type of description with the description of personhood and value? How would you actually bring those two together?
Well, I think that's the rub, right? And I think that's where I'm hoping we can make some meaningful progress. So when we talk about these sort of definitional truths, maybe another example will be helpful. Another classic example from philosophy. It is true by definition that if you are a bachelor, you are an unmarried male, right? So when we talk about these definitions, a river having two banks, a triangle adding its angles up to 180 degrees, those are inferences from empiricism, right? We have experiential knowledge of a river. We have a shared language. We can describe that together and we can come to a collective definition. But I don't think that, I actually don't know if we can get human value that way. Is there any empirical experience that, or at least a necessary deductive truth that will lend itself towards supporting the idea that humans have intrinsic values? I'm not so sure. I guess I'd be open to the argument. Yeah. I wanted to really briefly touch on a couple of the arguments that you gave, because you gave arguments for what I would consider a non-intercedent God, but
a Joel? I'm sorry.
A non-intercedent God. So, okay. For example, there is the ontological argument that argues that God is a necessary truth. Mm-hmm. It doesn't argue for a particular God, and it doesn't argue even that it has to be a good God. And there's a lot of classic arguments for God that people give that don't lend themselves towards a God that actually does value us as humans, right? So the God of Spinoza is simply a God that brings order to the universe, that brings the repeatability to the natural world, that was the first cause, but doesn't intercede in prayers, doesn't actually care, doesn't actually value anything. So I think that merely arguing that there's a God, therefore there's human value, I don't think that's sufficient. I think that there has to be a particular God.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree. Definitely.
Anyway, that was my brief pushback, because it seemed like the arguments you were giving were sort of classic theistic arguments. As opposed to something that would get to a specific.
Well, so definitely, Joe, I agree with you. Definitely, when it comes to approaching arguments for the existence of God, which I needed to approach them when I didn't believe, some of them, in fact, convinced me. It ended up being more kind of a cumulative case. Some of them are very powerful, the way I understand them. But yeah, I'm a Christian. So definitely the epistemological basis for a person that doesn't believe in God, in let's say for a moment, God, like in a general belief, right? It's not even talking about the Christian God, just to put it that way, this is what it is. We can actually find meaning in what we see inside of the system, inside of what we see the universe. Now, beyond that, I think that is not that there are different ways to approach that. This question is not; those questions are not interesting, or perhaps we cannot get knowledge about them. There are many ways to approach that. Now, definitely, for my basis of the way I experience the world and my worldview, as a Christian, I believe that the Bible has intrinsic value and truth in it. So in the Bible, since I believe it's true, there's in the first book, the first chapter in Genesis 1:27, there's a beautiful verse in which God is actually telling that human beings are created in his own image. And I think it's actually true, not only because it's in the Bible, it's also because I've experienced that outside of it. And I actually believed that was true even when I wasn't a Christian. So definitely as a Christian, I need to bring that to the table, because that's the way you think about it. Now, perhaps I'm going ahead of myself. So yeah, Elliott, I'll give you just 1 second.
Real quick, because I think because this will be really, really quick.
Yeah.
And I think Joel will be able to tell me if I'm a little bit off on this, because you're much more studied in philosophy than I am, man. Isn't that kind of the Euthyphro dilemma, though, with the humans have intrinsic value, and I know because God said? Because then the question is, do we have the value because God said it, or do we have the value and then God said it? And does that? I know that's not the entire underpinning for it for you.
Yeah.
But if is that potentially a weak link in the cumulative case there? Like, hey, maybe this is part of this same kind of philosophical discussion we've had, and we don't have a great answer, so throw that one away and think about others,
Yeah, there's something interesting about the Euthyphro dilemma that was written before the final. Of course, I need to talk in this language because I'm a Christian theist. The Euthyphro dilemma was written before the revelation of Christ, and it's actually a very interesting dilemma. Now, when building a dilemma, it could be kind of a false dilemma, because the way it is understood in the Christian tradition is because the intrinsic essence. I don't know if it's an oxymoron. I'm saying both things mean the same, but you forgive me. It's actually that goodness is actually the essence of God. So that dilemma is not a problem. Now, from the way goodness was understood in the let's say the pre-Socratic movement, and also more in the Platonic sense, I can see how that dilemma could be kind of a knockdown argument in some instances. But from the concepts of God, from the Judeo-Christian values, the way we understand him, I don't think that dilemma stand, even though I think it's actually a very, very cool way of thinking about it. Joe, go ahead.
But I think the problem you're running into is goodness and value aren't the same thing. I guess I might be having a hard time understanding of what you mean by value. because I could accept your argument when it comes to something like morality, right? Perhaps morality is an intrinsic part of, or goodness, right? Morality or goodness are an intrinsic part of God, but that's I think different conceptually than value, right?
Yeah.
Because isn't value kind of subjective intrinsically? I mean, just to throw that word in there again, isn't that kind of how we understand? And Joel, please, I mean, like the philosophical,
we need
academic
you,
way of understanding the word value. What I mean, is that really where it's used more in a sense of like nobody really can say like objectively this is more valuable than this one, because at the end of the day that term just kind of, again, intrinsically means subjective?
So in terms of philosophy, I don't know of a specific definition of the term value.
And that is actually one of the problems I wanted to mention, but go ahead, Joel.
Right. Just in terms of the academic usage of the word, I think the only place where value has like a really strict meaning is like economics, which I don't think is what we're talking about. Perhaps it is.
No, yeah. So go ahead. Do you want to finish your thoughts, Joel?
I think that was about it. I think that it might be helpful if we could parse out a collective understanding of value.
Definitely. So when I think about value, I always I try to go beyond dichotomies, because dichotomies could actually, restrain my thinking. But it is my experience of the world just to hang out and spend time with people that believe in God, not only the Christian God though, and other people that don't believe in God. So I always start with this premise and how a person would actually find a type of definition from value from these worldviews. And my first point was going to be that when we find trying to define value, we actually don't agree. And that says a lot about, it says a lot about a lot, but I actually don't know how to pinpoint this. If we have a problem in order to define something that we think is so important in our lives, where do you think that would lead us? Because in terms of goodness, because I believe in God, I believe in Christ, I can pinpoint and say, of course you can say, yeah, that's not true. I can say, yeah, this is good. This is goodness. Now, in terms of value, there are definitely different degrees in experience that we could say, well, this is valuable, this is not. But in terms of something that could kind of describe and encompass all the human experience, the term value, I should give more thought to that. I don't know if we could equate that to goodness, but but something I would like to throw out there and see what you guys think about this. It seems that we actually get to agree, even though we don't have a definition for it. Many people get to think about things that are valuable, and they agree beyond culture, race, and religion. Don't you think?
Well, sure. So I think a bottle of Aquafina water is much more valuable to somebody in the Sahara Desert than somebody on the shores of Lake Erie, right? Yeah. And I think that's where I guess I'm trying to figure out how we can make some progress through this inherent subjectivity of the word. Now, as I understand it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you're trying to, and I don't think this is necessarily wrong or bad, but trying to equate value and goodness.
I don't think, I'll be honest with you, Joel. I don't think they're the same thing, because value, for me at this moment, I can think that value entails some type of judgment. So it depends. Value is more contingent. And goodness, I can think about it as necessary. That's the way I would approach it as a theist, But now, in terms of philosophy and definitions, definitely I would be open to be corrected. But that's the way I would see it. Now, because of knowing what intrinsic goodness is, then I could actually be more sure of the kind of value systems, of the kind of value judgments that I make about the world. That's everything I can say about it at this moment. So let me ask you that question, Elliott. You go first if you want to.
and I've been, you guys might have seen me in my little box, kind of looking off and raising my eyebrows and thinking, because I'm trying to give a really concise definition for value, and one isn't exactly popping into my head all perfect. So it is a hard thing to define for sure. But I think Joel's right when he says about that goodness and value aren't equal. They're not equated. But I think there may be in the concept of value, because generally in the concept of value, we're thinking of almost hierarchical, in the sense of like, gold is more valuable than silver, and copper is less valuable than gold, and so maybe there is this idea, like you just said, if you're able to pinpoint exactly through Jesus or God, Allah, Shiva, whoever, if you're able to pinpoint exactly what is intrinsic goodness, then I think you can get to the value of things, but again, maybe only in that hierarchical sense. Like maybe we can only say this should be more valued than this because this is closer to the definition of intrinsic good. Mm-hmm. But especially if like I'm not positive there is an intrinsic good about the universe. Maybe objective answers to a subjective goal about what is good and bad, moral and immoral. But I do. This is a really good point. Like this concept of what exactly is the easy definition of value when we use it in these conversations and so forth. Mm-hmm. That is a tough thing for sure. But in fairness, I'm not positive that we necessarily need a great definition. Just the same with, I'm not positive that we necessarily ever need to have the complete or perfect definition of what it means of well-being, right? Yeah. Like we may never perfectly encompass that concept, but we may get to at least the point where we can make some very general judgments that we can pretty much, I mean, the three of us here, I think we can all agree, me standing up and cutting someone's head off is immoral. And whether we base that on God and Jesus or well-being, I think we still get to that same conclusion, which is definitely important. But yeah, honestly, man, I'm probably going to think about this all night, you guys.
Yeah, me too.
I'm going to go get 3 different dictionaries.
Yeah, me too. So let me ask you a question, because just trying to go back with the topic at hand. We're talking about this. But just more specific when it comes to human value and to see if that is essential in our experience. Now, what do you guys think beyond finding the prospects of finding a good definition for it? What does your experience of life tell you about the question?
So this actually will segue nice to my thesis that I failed to actually give in my opening statement, but I actually had one prepared. And I do actually affirm the proposition. I do think that, I'll at least affirm part of the proposition. I do think that there is value in all humans. And my reason for this is we as humans are a communal species. We're not very fast. We're not very strong. We wouldn't survive very long on the plains just based upon our physical attributes. We have our intelligence and we have our ability to work together and to plan. To that end, nearly every single person, human, which we might have to get into the definition of that word, but tabling that for a moment, every single human could, in potential, contribute something to our collective endeavor of surviving and thriving in humanity. So I think that is, I guess, the most I'm willing to cede. I think that all humans are valuable towards contributing towards the collective end of the human purpose.
So then does it mean, Joe, that in certain situations when survival is not at stake, then human value could be judged in different ways?
Could you give me an example
Yeah,
to flesh out the
that
question?
is that when it comes to giving examples, man, it's always, I need to be better at this. So
That's the rub, man. That's like the hardest part of philosophy is, you know, giving good
definitely, that's
examples.
why, yeah, definitely.
And
I come to
real
this
quick,
conversation wanted to learn always. So an example is, for example, um, perhaps I can give you some ideas at the conceptual level, and you, if you want to concede, you could help me find one. So, if we together are in a situation in which we cannot, like um, survival is at stake, right? And then the judgment changes. Okay, so actually, human value is not as important as we thought right now, because we need to eliminate 50% of the population because of such and such. Then does this entail, this is what I understand, that this definition that we are really wanted to grasp is actually not a true definition, because it's malleable in terms of the experience that we have of it.
Well, I don't think that that's necessarily a defeater for the idea that that I was talking about earlier. Insofar as in the situation that you described, this what we would call like a drastic emergency, a life or death situations. I think that there's other considerations there that might supersede the inherent human value, right? But that doesn't mean that the inherent human value or the potential for any particular person to contribute towards the endeavor of humanity, that doesn't negate that. That doesn't mean it's never there. It just means that based upon these specific circumstances, let's say we're sinking on a ship and we have to decide, you know, we're on the Titanic. Do we save the women and children, or do we save, you know, the strong, burly men? Right? It's just that it becomes a different moral equation, and then we might have to sort of consider other reasons.
So if there weren't any urgency in terms of surviving, then according to the way you talked about it, please, Joel, help me understand. If survival wasn't a problem, would this entail that there wouldn't be any type of human value, because you equate it with survival?
Well, survival is always a problem. Survival is never not a problem. We are literally always trying to survive, right? And I think that even someone that's like, let's say, has a severe mental impairment, and they are relying upon the state, or they're relying upon some caretaker for their day-to-day needs. Even that person that on its face value, prima facie, perhaps cannot contribute to society. Even, and I hate to say it that way because it is perhaps not, you know, maybe I didn't use the best phrase, but somebody that has some significant impairment, they can contribute in other ways. They can contribute because they teach us empathy. They can contribute because they're an outlet for people to love, right? One of the things that make people happy is to have someone to love and to have someone to take care of. And that in itself is contributing towards our human endeavor. So I don't think that, to answer your question succinctly, I don't think that there is ever a situation where we're not in a survival mode. There could be particular situations where the situation warrants, like I said, a different moral considerations, but I think we're always surviving. And I think that humans, again, ignoring the messy definition of that word, humans always have the potential to contribute towards that end.
So let me try to thank you for that, Joe.
If I could jump on real
Elliott.
quick, because first I want to say I think what Joel was just saying right there regarding you know, the potential for humans to contribute to societal means in one way, I think that's very much where I come to this in that concept. And I think, again, there is, leaving aside the messiness of what equals a human just right now, but there may be in that that criteria these specific things that makes us say, like, well, yes, this absolutely, we can show this objectively, that every time there's a human being in the world, there are these potentials for bringing empathy or awareness or you know, contributing monetarily or whatever it is to society. I definitely think that is probably the best starting point I'm at. And then just touching on kind of what you were saying about, but certain specific situations changing our calculus for what we do. I think this is the difference between situational and relative ethics, right? Like in various situations, there are two, maybe let's say, fundamental principles that are butting heads, and we have to figure out what is the more correct or less correct options. But it doesn't mean that we're just willy-nilly changing everything. And I definitely, I hear this sometimes where people are saying, well, in this particular situation, you'd save the dog over the child. And it's like, well, but you put so many constraints on it that it's like there's so many other things that we have to go through. And again, just because in the difference between a situation of the Titanic, sinking in the middle of the ocean, and we decide, look, we're going to take these people first and we're going to get them off first. That doesn't mean it's relative. It doesn't mean that we just kind of willy-nilly say, well, if you want to do it this time, it's fine. And if you want to do it another way, another time, it's fine. I think that's, exactly what Joel said. That's the rub, right? We got to figure out those specific, nuanced outlier situations where we've got, let's say, autonomy coming up against, I don't know, some other fundamental super great thing we all value.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. Yes. I still, there's something, can you believe, guys, that it's 6:50 already? Like, we need to finish this conversation in 10
almost
minutes.
Done. That's terrible.
I just, well, so what happened, and perhaps I just didn't express it well. At the beginning, you guys and me too, we were trying to find a definition that would help us understand what value was. Or human value, to be more specific. But then when we pushed beyond this, you, Joel, talks about experience only, which is something about experience, and you talk about survival. So it's like there's something that perhaps in terms of definition, I don't know how a definition of value would take us to experience and survival. But my question was, if we were to live in a world in which survival wasn't a problem, then according to the way that you described human value, which was actually communal survival, then that definition would change. This is what I'm saying. I'm talking about a possible world in terms, but I'm just saying that in the way that perhaps you're approaching this is more malleable. So we're running into the same problem here. It seems just the way that you might be defining this is it's a little bit of relative, or it depends on experience. So that's where my mind is going.
Sure. So I think if there was a world, and perhaps this is a possible world, where humans did not have to rely on one another at all, not for shelter, not for food, not for anything, not for, if we were, I guess, immortal and manna from heaven fell down upon us so that we consume it, and there was millions of prefabricated houses that were bestowed upon us, again, from heaven, then perhaps then there wouldn't be human value. Perhaps you're right. I don't think that's malleable, because I don't think that situation that I describe is likely to happen. I don't think that is
no, definitely.
I think right. So go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry. Well, I was just going to say, kind of on that, I think let's try and progress. Let's try and progress the world from where we are now, hypothetically, to a future world where we've taken care of all, the cancers and the wildfires and the tornadoes, like all the terrible things, right? And let's again, hypothetically, think about it from a perspective where somehow we're able to create that perfect, universal utopia, amongst human society and so forth. I don't know for a fact, I don't have anything I can just show that says this definitely works out, but I think in that scenario, one of the only ways that we get there is by having some basic core fundamental, quote unquote, fundamental values of what we think humans have. and expanding on that. So those don't ever go away. We've just now moved further on. Like 100 years ago, we said the essentials are food, water, shelter. Well, now there are people in various countries around the world saying, well, it's food, water, shelter, and electricity. Like these are the core things that humans need to survive. And maybe as we progress societally, we'll get to this place where, again, those underlying values, now we have different ones that we focus on, but those are still entailed in every one of these new ones. But again, I don't think we could even approach something like that without such a universal understanding, a universal agreement on what those building blocks would be to even get to that point. We don't get to say that electricity is a fundamental thing for humans until we've gotten the water, food, the shelter. Does that kind of make sense? Or
Oh, yes. Yeah. So Elliott, I mean, in 5 minutes, we need to finish this conversation. I do have questions about this last thing that you said. I mean, we're talking about human values, but I don't know if we're talking about the intrinsic value of human life. Now, when in everything that you said, Elliott, you said words like perfect, terrible, getting there in terms of something better than what we have here, and fundamental. And I would love to explore those words in your worldview.
In 5 minutes, I got it. Here we go.
Could you explain in a nutshell, in 30 seconds?
Well, on a lot of those words, for sure, they're one of those things where you take the 30 minutes of the beginning, 2-hour discussion to say, what do we mean by fundamental? What do we mean by this? What do we mean by that? And again, I think kind of going back to what I said at the beginning, the idea that maybe there is a set of criteria that equals human. Mm-hmm. And when something has all of those boxes checked, we as humans just all agree, yep, there's value. There's value in that thing. And I think it's possible that we can get to that from this idea of existence, life. It's possible that we can build up into that, but only by maintaining those core criteria again, and that would be the fundamental attributes of something, right? Mm-hmm. Like again, it has to follow the laws of logic, because if it doesn't follow the laws of logic, it doesn't exist. But then it has to be alive, and if it's not alive, then it can't have consciousness, and if it doesn't have consciousness, maybe there's this set of steps that we can work our way up to, and again, never really getting rid of those other ones. But now that we've let's say surpassed them, in the sense, again, kind of going back to the survival thing. I mean, I agree with Joel. As human beings, as living things, we are constantly in a state of survival, and just total off the wall hypothetical, how the heck would we do this? Let's just say tomorrow we wake up and none of us are in this state of constant survivability. We just live forever. The manna falls from heaven. I love that. All that stuff. And maybe what then happens is we no longer say things like, oh, well, do we really make sure that we have consent from people before we have them do things? Or because now we're no longer in this state where we're constantly fighting for our scraps, maybe we, quote unquote, evolve to a different type of set of values that we go for.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not going to sleep tonight thinking about what the definition of value is.
Okay, so I'll give you, Joe, I'm going to give you a few words definitely before we finish, but I'll share an idea that I'm just having. I just wrote down some of the things that you said, Elliott. I would like to pursue that in a later episode, like non-logic entails non-existence, and some of these statements that I think there, and then also like finding values, like which entails some type of direction, or ought-to-ness. I don't know if that's a word, but well, so why don't we call this, let me see, is human life intrinsically valuable, part 1?
Ha 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 ha. So actually, that's what I was about to say. Is I think
Yes.
that we need to have a round two.
Yes.
I think a good conclusion, is supposed to restate your thesis, and I'm about to not do that. I'm about to try to maybe I'm about to prime it for part two. But I think
yes, we'll have a part two. Okay, guys, if you guys want to.
Real quick, one last point though, because I think this is right precisely where I'm having a problem, and that is the words intrinsic and value going together. So I don't have a problem with saying that perhaps all humans have value. I have a problem with saying that there is this intrinsic definitional quality to the value. My problem with it specifically is, again, to me at least, colloquially, baked into the word value is a perceiver. And if something is contingent upon a perceiver, if something only happens if a perceiver perceives it, I don't think that we can call it an intrinsic characteristic of that property. Going back to triangles, if there was no humans, if there's no conscious agents, a triangle would still add up to 180 degrees. Human value, I don't know. At least for part one, I'm unconvinced that that's the case.
Yeah, if I may, I'll just say on that. Yeah, I kind of think I see where you're going. Like, even if there is a set of criteria that equals human, it's still at the end of the day the perceivers, us, the human, that subjectivity to it, that is ultimately defining the value, and therefore we can't get to that objective, inherent, essential, intrinsic aspect. Is that kind of what you're saying, Joel?
That's a good summation. I don't want to go too far beyond that because we all gave ourselves.
We'll be here all night.
I'll just say something, guys. It's interesting because how interesting, worldview and belief, and because that particular problem, I don't see it as a problem at all in my worldview. It is not, because it's clear that. That humans have intrinsic value in themselves. But why don't we take it? I'll write it down when we finish, and we'll take it from there in part two. Okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Well, Joel and Elliott, as I always say, we have these conversations, we disagree and all of that. Inside of the disagreement, then people watch this either live or digitally, and they go, okay, there's something beyond the disagreement, which is we can actually do this and nothing happens. So that's the metaphysics of the conversation.
So, and that's valuable. Whether or not we know what that word means, that's valuable.
So I really appreciate spending time with you, and we'll have a part two about this. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you very much. And if you guys want to contact me with any questions about the show, you can email me at askandwondered@gmail.com. Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you very much, Elliott.
And Merry Christmas.
Yes, Merry Christmas.